At 65, Colin Firth has finally revealed something that caught a lot of people off guard. Not during a carefully planned interview, not while standing on a red carpet surrounded by flashing cameras, and not through a polished statement written by a publicist. The actor who made millions swoon as Mr. Darcy and later won an Oscar for playing a king struggling to find his voice, has been carrying a much more personal story behind the scenes for years. Now he's opening up about the greatest love of his life. But here's the surprising part. The answer isn't who most people expected. In fact, the truth seems far more complicated than the romantic image many fans had built around him over the decades. Colin Andrew Firth was born on September 10, 1960, in Greyshot, Hampshire, England. His father worked as a history lecturer, while his mother was a scholar of comparative religion. The household was filled with discussions about philosophy, history, and big ideas, rather than emotional conversations. As a child, Colin felt things deeply, but he struggled to express those feelings openly. Acting eventually became the outlet he had been searching for. At the Drama Centre London, Colin wasn't necessarily the most naturally gifted student in the room. Even he recognized that others often seemed more confident or talented. But there was something about him that stood out. Casting directors began noticing his rare ability to communicate emotion without saying much at all. A glance, a pause, a subtle expression could tell an entire story. That gift would later help him win some of the biggest awards in the industry. Yet it didn't come from acting classes alone. It came from years of quietly keeping emotions buried beneath the surface. Growing up, he learned to analyze feelings instead of fully expressing them. That habit helped create unforgettable performances, but it also shaped the way he handled relationships throughout his life. He became skilled at hiding pain behind a calm exterior. The armor looked strong from the outside, but underneath, things were often much more complicated. It was a pattern that followed him for decades. Everything changed in 1995 when Colin stepped into one of the most famous roles of his career. The BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice transformed him into a global sensation. One iconic scene turned Mr. Darcy into a cultural phenomenon, and suddenly, Colin Firth became the face of a certain kind of romantic ideal. Quiet, reserved, deeply emotional, yet unable to easily express those emotions. Fans everywhere became fascinated with the character. Women admired him. Men compared themselves to him. And before long, the line between Colin Firth and Mr. Darcy started becoming blurry in the public imagination. The strange part was that Colin never aggressively chased celebrity status. Fame seemed to find him instead. But it arrived attached to a character whose emotional restraint was viewed as attractive and noble. For Colin, that created a challenge. People fell in love with Mr. Darcy and then expected Colin himself to be exactly the same person away from the cameras. For years, he played along. Then came the Bridget Jones films, which only strengthened that image. Mark Darcy was patient, dependable, and endlessly understanding. He represented the dream partner, someone willing to stay loyal and supportive no matter how chaotic life became. Audiences adored him. But once again, there was a major difference between the character and the real man behind the role. While the characters appeared calm and secure, Colin himself often seemed like someone who gave far more than he received. He rarely demanded attention for his own struggles and often kept personal difficulties hidden from public view. In 2011, Colin won the Academy Award for The King's Speech. The role centered on a monarch struggling to overcome his fears and finally speak honestly. Looking back, many people find the parallels fascinating. Here was Colin portraying someone learning to find his voice while he was still keeping parts of his own life carefully guarded. The public saw confidence and success. The private reality was far more layered. Long before the Italian chapter of his life and the headlines that would eventually surround it, there was another woman who played a major role in Colin's story. Her name was Meg Tilly. This part of his life is often overlooked, but it reveals a side of Colin that many people never knew existed. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't built around celebrity events or Hollywood attention. Instead, it was deeply personal and surprisingly ordinary. They met in 1989 while filming Valmont. Meg Tilly was already an accomplished actress with an impressive career. She had earned major recognition for her performances and was raising 2 children from a previous marriage. But what truly captured Colin's attention wasn't her success. It was her authenticity. Meg had experienced real hardship growing up. She has spoken openly about living through difficult circumstances during childhood and learning resilience at a very young age. There was a grounded quality about her that Colin found impossible to ignore. Unlike many people in the entertainment world, she wasn't performing for anyone. She simply seemed comfortable being herself. For a man who had spent much of his life hiding behind emotional walls, that kind of honesty was incredibly powerful. The relationship quickly became serious. In a move that surprised many people, Colin stepped away from the fast-moving world of entertainment and relocated to British Columbia, Canada. Instead of red carpets and industry events, he found himself living a completely different life. He moved into a remote cabin surrounded by nature. There were no constant cameras, no endless celebrity obligations, and no daily attention from the media. He helped raise Meg's children, worked around the home, and embraced a quieter existence that few fans could have imagined. For several years, Colin wasn't focused on building a celebrity image. He was focused on family. Their son, Will, was born in 1990, and those years remain some of the most meaningful periods of his life according to people close to the couple. Friends who knew them during that time have often described those years as some of the happiest Colin ever experienced. The simplicity of that lifestyle gave him something Hollywood couldn't provide. Meg later reflected on their relationship in deeply emotional terms. She once suggested that during those years together, both of them believed they had found the person they would spend their lives with. That belief makes the eventual ending even more heartbreaking. The relationship ended in 1994. It wasn't because of one dramatic event. Instead, it appears that life gradually pulled them in different directions. Career ambitions played a role. Colin's acting opportunities were growing, while the realities of balancing family life and professional goals became increasingly difficult. Sometimes relationships don't collapse overnight. Sometimes they slowly drift apart, despite the best intentions of everyone involved. Eventually, Colin returned to England. What happened next changed everything. Within a year, he became Mr. Darcy and one of the most recognizable actors in Britain. Practically overnight, the man who had spent years living quietly in the Canadian wilderness found himself at the center of global attention. Although Colin has rarely spoken publicly about the emotional cost of leaving that chapter behind, its importance remains obvious. His son Will eventually pursued acting as well and later moved to England, creating a new connection between both parts of Colin's life. Years later, when Colin received major recognition for his work, Meg demonstrated that the respect between them had survived long after the relationship ended. Following one of his major award victories, she publicly celebrated his success with a warm and heartfelt message that reflected genuine affection and admiration. Then another important chapter began. In 1996, Colin met Livia Giugioli while working on the BBC miniseries Nostromo in Italy. She was working behind the scenes as a production assistant. Livia brought a completely different energy into his life. She was passionate, creative, deeply interested in environmental causes, and carried a warmth that immediately caught his attention. For Colin, who had spent much of his life carefully controlling emotions, her personality was both exciting and intimidating. She seemed driven by purpose rather than celebrity culture. That independence was something he found incredibly attractive. When you look closely at Colin Firth's romantic history, a pattern starts to emerge. Time and time again, he appears drawn to women who already have strong identities, ambitions, and passions of their own. Women who do not need him to define their lives. Meg had her children, her career, and her independence. Livia had her activism, her family, and her own vision for the future. Colin seemed fascinated by people who arrived with fully developed worlds already in place. And rather than asking those worlds to revolve around him, he often adapted himself to fit inside them. It was a trait that made him deeply supportive and loyal, but it may also explain why he sometimes struggled to express his own needs openly. For someone who spent a lifetime mastering silence, speaking up for himself was often the hardest role of all. Colin adapted. He supported me. He invested in the dreams that mattered to Livia. He praised her work publicly and rarely placed himself at the center of the story. When she preferred focusing on projects instead of celebrity events, he often arrived at premieres and red carpets alone. Journalists would ask where she was, and Colin would simply smile and explain that she had more important things to do than spend her evenings walking through flashing cameras. He sounded proud when he said it too, like a man who believed he had found exactly the relationship he wanted. The couple married in 1997 and built a life that looked impressive from every angle. They welcomed 2 sons, Luca and Matteo. They split their time between London and a beautiful property in Umbria, Italy. Livia transformed the estate into an environmentally conscious retreat filled with purpose and passion. Colin supported those ambitions every step of the way, and to the public they seemed like one of the entertainment world's most grounded couples. But behind the polished image, another story may have been unfolding. While Livia's vision expanded, Colin often appeared content stepping further into the background. The world saw partnership. What few people noticed was how often he seemed willing to put his own needs aside to make room for someone else's dreams. Then there is one detail that makes this entire story feel almost unbelievable. In 2003, Colin starred in Love Actually as Jamie, a heartbroken writer who retreats to France after discovering his girlfriend has betrayed him. During his time there, he falls for a Portuguese housekeeper and eventually travels across Europe to make a bold and emotional proposal in a language he barely knows. It was romantic, awkward, funny, and completely unforgettable. Audiences loved every second of it. What many fans never realized is that Colin had already done something surprisingly similar in real life. Before marrying Livia, he took the time to learn Italian, not for a movie role, not for publicity, not because a script required it. He learned it because he loved an Italian woman and wanted to connect with her in her own language. That gesture reveals a lot about who Colin was during those years. He wasn't simply playing devoted characters on screen, he was living that devotion in real life. He invested himself completely into the people he loved. The question that slowly emerged over the next decade was whether the version of himself he had created for love truly reflected who he was deep down. Or had he spent so many years adapting to everyone else's needs that he lost sight of his own? In 2011, Colin stood on the Academy Awards stage and accepted the Oscar for Best Actor for The King's Speech. The movie followed a man struggling to overcome fear, pressure, and self-doubt in order to finally speak openly. Looking back, the symbolism feels almost impossible to ignore. As always, Colin appeared calm, charming, and gracious. The audience applauded. Livia looked radiant. It seemed like the perfect Hollywood ending. Years of hard work, sacrifice, and commitment had brought him to one of the greatest achievements of his career. From the outside, everything looked flawless, but appearances can be deceiving. While the cameras captured smiles and celebration, challenges inside the marriage were reportedly becoming harder to ignore. The cracks were hidden from public view, and even Colin may not have fully understood how serious things had become. By 2015, he and Livia had quietly separated. There were no dramatic public announcements, no explosive interviews, no tabloid war. Only a small circle of friends knew the couple was spending time apart while trying to determine whether their marriage could still be saved. During that period of separation, Livia reconnected with Marco Brancaccia, an Italian journalist she had known for years. What reportedly began as reconnecting eventually developed into a romantic relationship. Because much of it unfolded in Italy, it initially remained outside the attention of British tabloids. Then things became even more complicated. When Colin and Livia reconciled in 2016, the relationship with Marco came to an end. Unfortunately, that was not the end of the story. Disagreements and tensions followed afterward, with both sides later offering very different accounts of what happened next. The situation exploded into public view in 2018. Media outlets across Italy began reporting on legal complaints involving allegations of unwanted contact and harassment. The story generated enormous attention almost immediately. Colin publicly supported his wife and released statements standing by her side. He attached his name and reputation to her version of events without hesitation. To many observers, it looked exactly like the kind of loyalty fans had always associated with him. Once again, Colin appeared to be the dependable man willing to stand beside someone he loved, no matter how difficult the circumstances became. Then another twist arrived. In 2019, major developments emerged that changed the public conversation surrounding the situation. Statements released afterward acknowledged that the earlier relationship had been consensual. Additional communications and messages became part of public reporting, leading many media outlets to re-examine the entire story. Suddenly, headlines shifted. The controversy generated intense scrutiny, particularly in Italy. Commentators debated what had happened, who was responsible, and how the situation had spiraled so dramatically. For Colin, however, the personal impact may have been even more significant than the public reaction. Many observers felt he had been placed in an incredibly painful position. He had publicly defended his spouse, only to find himself caught in a situation that became far more complicated than initially understood. The trust that had supported their relationship for decades was now under enormous strain. For someone who valued loyalty above almost everything else, the emotional fallout must have been devastating. As the story continued unfolding, Colin largely withdrew from public discussion. He avoided dramatic interviews and offered very little commentary. Silence had always been his preferred way of handling pain, and once again he retreated inward rather than turning personal struggles into public spectacle. In December 2019, Colin and Livia announced that they were separating. The following year, while much of the world was focused on lockdowns and uncertainty, their divorce was finalized. For the first time in decades, Colin found himself entering a completely new chapter of life. His sons were now adults. The future looked uncertain. The life he had spent years building was changing faster than he could have imagined. The man who had learned another language for love, relocated countries for relationships, and shaped much of his identity around family suddenly faced the challenge of starting over at 60. And this is where Stanley Tucci enters the story. Not as a celebrity acquaintance, not as a casual Hollywood friendship, but as someone who became an important source of support during one of the most difficult periods of Colin's life. The two actors had known each other since working together on Conspiracy in 2001. Over the years, their friendship quietly grew stronger away from public attention. It wasn't the kind of relationship that generated headlines. It was genuine, private, and built on mutual respect. Years earlier, when Stanley suffered the heartbreaking loss of his first wife, Kate, to cancer, Colin had reportedly been there for him. Not with grand public gestures, not with publicity, simply as a friend when it mattered most. Now the roles seemed reversed. As Colin dealt with the collapse of his marriage and the uncertainty that followed, Stanley became one of the people who stayed close. The support wasn't flashy. It didn't make entertainment headlines. But sometimes, those are the friendships that matter most. Then came Supernova. Released in 2020 and directed by Harry McQueen, the film brought the two friends together on screen in a deeply emotional story about love, loss, and facing painful realities. For audiences, it was a powerful drama. For Colin, many viewers later felt it seemed to reflect emotions he was still processing in his own life. The performance carried a different weight. There was vulnerability there, sadness, reflection, a sense of someone confronting truths that had been buried for years. Whether intentional or not, Supernova became more than just another acting project. It arrived at exactly the moment Colin was rebuilding himself. And for perhaps the first time in a very long time, the emotions he had spent decades keeping hidden no longer seemed quite so far beneath the surface. In Supernova, Colin Firth plays Sam, a musician who has spent 20 years building a life with his partner, Tusker, played by Stanley Tucci. Their relationship is filled with love, history, and countless shared memories. But everything changes after Tusker is diagnosed with early-onset dementia. Knowing that time is no longer on their side, the two set out on a journey across England's Lake District, revisiting the places that shaped their life together. Every stop carries emotional weight because both men understand that this could be their last opportunity to experience these moments as they once did. Sam is the one trying to hold everything together. He worries constantly, plans ahead, and refuses to accept what seems inevitable. The film asks a painful question that resonates long after the credits roll. What does it mean to love someone when there is nothing left to fix? Audiences connected deeply with that struggle. Critics praised both performances, and many described the chemistry between Firth and Tucci as absolutely devastating in the best possible way. The film earned widespread acclaim and became one of the most emotionally powerful projects of Colin's later career. Watching Colin in the role felt different from many of his previous performances. There was a rawness to it that audiences could immediately sense. As Sam fought to hold on to a life that was slipping away, many viewers felt they were seeing more than acting. It was as if Colin was channeling some of his own experiences into the character, using the role to process emotions that were still difficult to express openly. The heartbreak on screen felt authentic because the man portraying it had recently experienced his own personal upheavals. Then came The Staircase in 2022, one of the most unexpected roles of Colin's entire career. He portrayed Michael Peterson, the controversial writer whose life became the center of a highly publicized murder investigation. It was a dramatic departure from the honorable, dependable characters that had followed Colin for decades. Peterson was complicated, divisive, and surrounded by questions that never seemed to have simple answers. For an actor long associated with integrity and trustworthiness, the casting immediately caught people's attention. The choice was intentional. After years of being viewed as the ultimate gentleman, Colin seemed determined to challenge that image. Michael Peterson was a man whose charm often raised suspicions rather than reassurance. The role explored how public personas can differ dramatically from private realities, and that theme appeared to fascinate Colin. It was difficult material, but it allowed him to step far beyond the shadow of Mr. Darcy and the romantic image that had followed him for most of his career. While working on the staircase, another important chapter quietly began. Colin met Maggie Cohn, a writer and producer known for her work on American Crime Story and Narcos, Mexico. Maggie had built a successful career telling stories about complicated people, hidden truths, and the ways individuals often deceive themselves. She understood human behavior on a deep level, and many people who followed Colin's story found that detail especially interesting. In February 2022, reports emerged that the two had been spotted together in West London. Witnesses described them as relaxed, engaged, and completely absorbed in conversation. One observer told reporters that they appeared deep in conversation and looking very happy. For longtime followers of Colin Firth, that description stood out. He had always been known as private and reserved, yet here he seemed unusually comfortable. Reports described him joking, laughing, and enjoying himself in a way that felt natural rather than guarded. Later that year, in October 2022, the pair made their public debut at the premiere of Empire of Light during the London Film Festival. It was the first time in years that Colin had attended a major public event with a partner. The photographs quickly attracted attention, not because they looked glamorous or staged, but because they looked genuine. They stood close together with an ease that suggested real comfort rather than performance. Many observers noted that neither appeared interested in creating headlines. Instead, they simply looked happy to be sharing the moment. That difference mattered. For decades, much of the world viewed Colin through the lens of the characters he played. Millions saw Mr. Darcy, Mark Darcy, or countless other romantic figures. Maggie, however, seemed to know the person behind those roles. She wasn't reacting to a fantasy version of Colin Firth. She appeared interested in the real man, with all the experiences, disappointments, and lessons that came with him. This new chapter seemed to coincide with a broader shift in Colin's outlook on life. As he grew older, he appeared less interested in maintaining a carefully crafted image and more interested in living honestly. That became particularly noticeable during a 2025 interview when he shared a reflection that immediately captured attention. He said, "The love of your life is not always the person you spent the most time with, or the person you chose first, or the person you stood by when you should have walked away. Sometimes it is what you find when you stop performing and start telling the truth. When you stop accommodating other people's visions and start inhabiting your own." The quote sparked widespread discussion because it felt deeply personal. Colin did not mention any names. He did not point to a specific relationship or explain exactly who he was talking about. Instead, he spoke in the thoughtful, measured way that has always defined him. Yet many listeners sensed that there was more honesty in those words than ever before. Rather than talking solely about romance, he seemed to be describing a larger realization about identity, self-worth, and authenticity. At 65, Colin Firth is no longer the young actor emerging from a lake in a famous white shirt. He is no longer simply the patient romantic hero that audiences projected onto him for decades. He is a man who loved deeply, made enormous sacrifices, experienced heartbreak, and spent years trying to build meaningful relationships. He is someone who gave a great deal of himself to the people he cared about and who learned difficult lessons along the way.